All right, class, welcome back. We are going to start with Unit 4, which is the Industrial Revolution and the Rise of Nationalism. Oh. So, central to both of these trends, the Industrial Revolution and the rise of nationalism, we can start with the United Kingdom. Industrial Revolution started there for reasons that we'll get to in a minute, and it's also an example of this idea of nationalism. So the nationalism end first. I don't know how familiar you are with this part of the world, what's now called the United Kingdom. About 300 years ago, Scotland, Wales, and England joined to form Great Britain. So let's pause there. That island to the right here, the island of Britain, there's actually three nations on that relatively small island. There's Scotland, there's England, and there's Wales. So they're all British, but there are different nationalities just on that one little island. If you've ever seen Braveheart, that movie Braveheart, you know that the Scottish and the English have not always got along, to put it lightly. And later on, England invaded and conquered Ireland and joined that nation to form what was called the United Kingdom. So even in a relatively small part of the world, like the British Islands, you have, just on this image right here, four separate nations in a relatively small area. So this idea of nationalism is, we're all humans, yes, but we're also different. We have different cultures, languages, religions, et cetera, et cetera. So where does that end, right? How many separate, distinct nations are we going to divide ourselves into? That's one of the questions here. Now, let me go back to this map for a minute. England and Scotland, pretty similar. They share geography, they share certain history and culture, etc., but they're different. And about 10 years ago, there was a referendum, an election in Scotland, and they very nearly voted to declare independence and to say Scotland is going to be an independent nation, no longer part of the United Kingdom. And so you can see the images here, that shirt, Scottish, not British. So that's a Scottish nationalist saying, we don't want to be joined with England and Wales and Ireland. We want Scotland to be its own separate thing. We don't consider ourselves British, we're Scottish. And the guy in the bottom here, he's fired up, he voted. So this vote failed. Scotland rather remains part of the United Kingdom for now, but you can see that we go back to the 1707. So even 300 years later, a significant number of people in Scotland were still thinking about separating because they considered their Scottish identity to be more important than their British identity. And so you see that throughout different parts of the world. If you want to look into this for a current event, in Spain, for example, there's a region of Spain that similar to Scotland that wants to separate from the rest of Spain because they consider themselves distinct and unique and different from other Spanish people. So this is a constant thing throughout the world. Nations separating from other nations because they don't, they feel like they're their own separate, distinct thing. This video here, you can play this on your own time if you want. Well, let me play a couple seconds of it for you just to make a point in terms of nationalism. So this is a map of Europe, obviously. And whenever you see a map with nations on it, you should remind yourself that the map that you see with the borders and the names of the nations, it's just a snapshot at any given moment. And borders all over the world, wherever it is, Europe, Africa, the borders and the nations on the map change over time. Sometimes borders move, sometimes they entirely disappear. Sometimes nations combine with other nations. Sometimes nations split up into smaller and smaller groups. So you get the idea here. Let's skip ahead a little. Now there's empires and fewer nations. And then eventually we go back to there being more nations and fewer empires, right? We're getting up to World War I here. You see Poland, watch Poland is going to disappear at some point. Germany gets bigger, then Germany gets smaller. Here come the Nazis. There go the Nazis. Here come the communists, right? Countries are being added to the map, disappearing from the map. That is a constant thing throughout history. So the definition of nationalism, liberals, that's classical liberals, believed that each people, each national group had a right to establish its own independent government and fulfill its own destiny. That sounds totally reasonable. There are different nationalities throughout the world. You know, Nigerians and Germans are very different, obviously. You know, uh, Chinese and Brazilians are different in a lot of ways. And so shouldn't they have separate nations? Sure, it seems reasonable, of course. The question, like so many other things we cover in this course, is what's the limiting principle? Where does it end? So on this map here, we'll get back to this when we get to World War I, but this map here is map of Europe, and in the red border that you see there, that was the Austro-Hungarian Empire. That empire no longer exists because of nationalism. Today, what was one empire, that big red territory, is not one empire anymore. It is, well, look at the map, 9, 10, 12 separate nations within the borders of what used to be one thing. Now it's a bunch of separate, smaller, distinct things. Because if you look at some of the countries that are in that red area now, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. All right, well, Czech people are different from Austrians and Croatians and Romanians, etc. And Czech nationalists decided that they wanted their own nation, the Czech Republic, because, you know, Czechs are different from Bosnians. Okay, fine. The question is, where does it end? And which do you think would be a richer, more secure, more prosperous place to live? A big empire or a relatively small nation? Because you got to pick one. They're opposites. You see, if you live in an empire, like the area in red here, if that was all one thing, that's going to be a big nation. It's going to be wealthy because of its size. It's all going to have one economy, one infrastructure, road network, etc., one army, one set of laws. It's going to be big, it's going to be rich, it's going to be secure. However, every group within that empire is a minority. You see, in this example here, the Austrians would be a minority within that big, diverse empire. And Austrian nationalists might say, we want Austria to separate from the rest of these countries and form its own separate, independent nation for Austrians. Well, fine, but that's going to be a smaller, poorer, weaker, less secure nation than if it remained a big, huge empire. So you got to pick one. Do you want to live in a big, diverse country with all different nationalities? There's going to be some benefit to that, but each national group is going to be a minority, and they're going to have to share power with different types of people. So it's just back and forth, right? You got to pick one. Do you want to live in an empire, or do you want to live in a smaller, unique nation? And there's pros and cons to each, but you got to think that through. What could go wrong with nationalism? Well, an extreme version of nationalism that you're probably familiar with, a lot could go wrong. If you have this obsession with nationalism and national purity, and in the case of Nazi Germany, their obsession was Germany has to be full of Germans and no one else. So that's one problem, right? Because if you're not German and German nationalism is running wild, you're going to be persecuted. And the other side of that is every German person has to be included in Germany, for example, Therefore, what did the Nazis do? They invaded neighboring countries where other German people were living under the excuse of, you know, if there's German people in Poland, the Germans are going to invade Poland to try to take that territory because it's full of Germans, and they're obsessed with this idea of nationalism. So it can backfire, to put it lightly. Now, what if we had this approach in the United States? So there's different types of nationalism, and what I want you to understand here and think about and appreciate is the very unique way that Americans practice nationalism. So the Europeans and the Africans, etc., they're tribal in the sense that they define nationalism as a DNA thing. You're either in the group or you're not. Okay, you're either German or you're not. It's in your DNA. You can't become German, right? You're either born German or you're born something else. That's what the Europeans practice historically. And that has led to some problems, of course, to put it lightly, in European history. This obsession with, you know, Czechs are different from Serbians or different from Germans, and on and on and on. And they keep subdividing. In the United States, what does American nationalism mean? This is a unique thing about this country that is really important for you to understand. Our definition of nationalism, ideally, in theory, this is what it's supposed to be, okay, has nothing to do with race, DNA, ethnicity, biology, anything else. Because, as you know, this is the most diverse country in the world. We have all nationalities all mixed together. It's an amazing, unique thing that no other countries even try to do, okay? Because they have very different definitions of nationalism, right? For example, you can't become Japanese. If you are not born ethnically Japanese, you will never be Japanese. That's how most nationalism works. In America, any human being of any physical description, of any racial, ethnic backgrounds, any human can be an American. It's a universal thing. So what ties us together? What is American nationalism? It's not based on race. It's not based on ethnicity, language, religion, history. It's not based on any of that. In every other country, it is. Here, it's not. So what do we share as Americans? We don't share DNA. If we were in person, let's say there were 25 of us in the room, and I ask all of you where your families came from. If there are 25 of you, I would get, if I asked you country of origin, I'd probably get more than 25 answers. That's how diverse this country is. So what I mean by that is, for example, for me, if I was asked that question, where did my family come from? Ireland and Germany. My mother's grandparents came here 100 years ago from Ireland. My father's grandparents came here 100 years ago from Germany. So for me, one person, if I'm asked that question, I would have two answers. So that's how diverse this country is. You guys would have, you know, if there were 25 of us, we'd end up with probably 40 different countries of origin. So we don't share country of origin. We don't share race. We don't share ethnicity. We don't share religion, language, history. We don't share any of that. We're from all over the place. So what do we share? This might sound cheesy, but this is all we share. You ready? The Constitution. That's it. We're from all different places, different language, history, culture, religion, everything else. What do we share? The ideas that we talked about earlier of the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. That's it. That's all we share. We share the idea, in theory, that we're all created equal. We have certain rights that cannot be taken away, and that we all need to respect each other's rights to say whatever we want, even if we disagree with each other, to practice whatever religion we want, even if we disagree with each other. The Constitution. That's it. If we lose that, this country cannot survive. Look at this map here. Imagine if we define nationalism the way the Europeans do, for example, by ethnicity. Our country would shatter into a million pieces. New York City alone one single city in one state in this country. If we go down this road, New York City, just that city, would divide into dozens and dozens of little teeny nations that are each like, 5 square blocks. You want to live in a country like that where we define ourselves by our DNA? We can't do that. In a country this diverse, we can't do that. That's suicide. And by the way, look at this key over here. Look at the color coding. They're breaking down how diverse New York City is, right? And if we don't look at ourselves as, hey, we're all Americans, right? We're all one big diverse family. If we lose that, we're done. We lose our country. Look at the 3 shades of blue. So they're subdividing white people into different groups. Look at the dark one. Russian, Ukrainian. Pause. You don't need to be an expert on Russia and Ukraine. Have you watched the news for the last 3 years? Do you think Russians and Ukrainians are on the same page? The answer is obviously no, right? So even within that subdivision, there's even more subdivision. You know what I'm saying? So we, in this country, it's very unique. We are the most diverse country in the history of the world. It's an amazing experiment. We don't share DNA, ethnicity, all that stuff. What do we share? Ideas. That's it. So when we talk about nationalism, please understand American nationalism is very different from Japanese or German nationalism. It's an idea thing, not a DNA thing. And if we go down that DNA path, that's suicide for us. So let's not, okay? Back to the idea of empire versus nationalism. A large population and vast territory, those are benefits of empire, gave the empire economic military clout, but the downside, it potentially dissatisfied nationalists. All empires have this problem. The British, the French, the Ottomans, the Soviets. On this map, this is the Ottoman Empire, which no longer exists. Just like that other map I showed you, it's an empire in red that no longer exists. And now, just like the other map, you can see instead of all this area being one thing, one government, one economy, one military, etc., big, rich, diverse empire. Instead, because of nationalism, the Ottoman Empire is now what, 30 different countries? So why did it break up if it was so big and rich and powerful? Because of nationalism. Look at all the countries that are included in what was the Ottoman Empire. For example, we have Egypt, we have Israel, we have Greece, we have Romania. What do those places have in common? Religion? No. Language? No. History? No. Ethnicity? No. Race? No. Culture? No. They have nothing in common. Israelis and Romanians and Greeks and Egyptians have nothing in common other than they're all human beings. So why did this empire fall apart? Well, Greek nationalists, for example, did not want to share this big empire with, Israelis and Egyptians and Turks and Syrians and Romanians, because Greeks are different. They speak Greek, not Hebrew, not Arabic, right? They have their own unique history. Greeks have a very long, very distinct, proud, unique history. And Greek nationalists, for example, did not want to be a minority group in this big empire. They wanted Greece to be its own nation for Greek people, with Greek people in charge, where everyone speaks Greek and they have their own distinct culture. That's all good. Good for them. The cost of that is, instead of Greece being part of a big, rich, powerful empire, Greece is now a relatively small, relatively poor, relatively weak nation. So that's, you got to pick one, right? And there's pros and cons to each. But every empire is going to have this problem. Nationalist groups are going to want to break their nation away to be its own distinct, unique thing. All good. It's understandable. The question, though, is where's the line? Where does it stop? In terms of Central and South America, about 200 years ago, they win independence from Spain. And Brazil, of course, won independence from Portugal. Democracy did not take root in most of Central and South America. Simón Bolívar tried and failed to create an equivalent of the United States in Central and South America, a big, diverse, huge republic. And that failed because of nationalism. This chart here, you can see the rigid social hierarchy. Peninsulares were on top. That refers to people born on the Iberian Peninsula, Spain and Portugal. They were the dominant people. If you're born in Spain or Portugal and then come to South America, you're the most powerful people. Below them would be their descendants. So they're still ethnically European, but they were born in Brazil or Argentina rather than Spain or Portugal. Below them, you have two mixed race groups, mestizos, that's mixed European with Native American, mulattoes, that's mixed European with African. And then below them, you have who they considered the bottom of the hierarchy, the inferior Native Americans and Africans, West African slaves. So once again, in Central and South America, just like in Europe and most of the rest of the world, they're getting jammed up in DNA, in ethnicity, right? They're classifying people by what's in their genes, what's in their blood, not by ideas, not by individual merit or anything else. So that's the trap that hopefully in this country we avoid, all right? So in terms of Central and South America and nationalism, think about this. Think about Central America. Let's go south of Mexico. We have Guatemala, Honduras, Nicaragua, El Salvador, Costa Rica. Am I missing one? Belize, Panama. You got 6 or 7 teeny countries in between, let's say, Mexico and Colombia. Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, El Salvador, etc. Okay. Would Central America be better off if it were one country instead of 7? If Honduras, Nicaragua, Guatemala, etc., erased all those borders and all joined together into one country called whatever, the Central American Republic. And instead of 6 small, poor countries, Costa Rica, etc., they erased all the borders. They all got together. We're no longer Honduran or Nicaraguan or whatever. We're all Central Americans. That country would be bigger. It would be richer. It would be more prosperous. It would have one economy, one currency, one military, one set of borders, instead of 6 or 7 small, poor countries all jammed living next to each other. You see what I'm saying? Why hasn't that happened? I don't know. Apparently Guatemalans and Nicaraguans are different enough from each other in their own minds that they are proud of, no, I'm Guatemalan. I'm not Nicaraguan. We're different and we're going to have different nations. Fine. Good for them. But the cost is you're not as big and rich as you could be if you thought bigger and didn't get jammed up in subdividing nationalities. So we see that all over the world, right? Different nations. Right now, for example, if you look at the map of the world, there's roughly 200 nations. That's more than there have ever been. Historically, there would be huge empires. Now those empires are gone and they subdivide into nations because of this idea of nationalism. The Industrial Revolution, so these are the first factories, basically. There were a lot of things that we take for granted now that were not realities back then, a couple hundred years ago. There were no child labor laws early on. Later, of course, there were, and now we take that for granted that kids, for example, should not be working in factories when they're, 8 years old. No minimum wage, no workplace safety laws. So, no government regulations the way we would expect to have now. No unemployment or disability or retirement insurance. So if you get sick or hurt or you're just too old to work, you have no protection, no environmental regulations to protect from pollution, etc. One thing that you should keep in mind, though, I noted at the bottom there, photographs like this that came out during this period of these kids, working in factories in these terrible conditions, it's something we wouldn't tolerate now in our country. But the idea that children were working was not new at all, okay? Children had been working forever and often dying because some work is very dangerous for children. But the difference was it wasn't in cities and factories because those didn't exist. It was out in the countryside on the farm. So the idea that children were working wasn't new. What was new was the fact that, well, cameras existed and now we could document it. And the conditions were different because of these new factories. But the Industrial Revolution, it didn't create child labor, it ended child labor. You see the distinction? So that's something important to keep in mind. So as these new factories come online, these new technologies, steel, coal, steam power, later on oil, internal combustion engines, etc., it changes the economy and society radically. Railroads. We'll start with the railroads. The significance of that was we now have access to things that for all of human history we would never have access to because those things are from too far away. And railroads could travel further and quicker than any technology in all of human history, right? A train is a lot faster than a horse. And for all of human history until this point, you want to move something over lands, the fastest way to do that is on a horse. That's it. But now all of a sudden we have trains. So what does that mean? We have now access to things from markets that previously would have been way too far away, especially if we're talking about perishable goods, things that are perishable. They rot, they spoil, right? Food, obviously, is the most common perishable good. Flowers, right? Things like that. Bananas. This might sound trivial, but think about this. We're all in New England. As I'm recording this, I don't know when you're watching this, but as I'm recording this, I'm looking at my phone. It is literally 2 degrees outside. Okay. It's cold. I could drive 5 minutes from my house to a supermarket. I could walk into that supermarket in New England when it's 2 degrees outside. Okay. There's a foot of snow on the grounds. I can walk into a supermarket right now and buy a banana, a fresh banana. We all take this for granted. Let's pause and think about this. What is the closest place to Massachusetts or Rhode Island that bananas can grow? Because we're not growing them in Massachusetts when it's 2 degrees outside. Bananas are mostly from Guatemala and the Philippines, actually. So how on earth can people in New England have instant access to cheap, affordable, fresh, tropical fruits in the middle of a polar vortex? That doesn't make any sense, but we just take it for granted. Yeah, no problem. Go have a banana. That is an example of something that for all of human history until the Industrial Revolution, people that live in Massachusetts would never have eaten a banana ever. They would have never seen a banana because how is a banana supposed to get from Guatemala to Massachusetts before the industrial age when we have all this amazing technology? It wouldn't be possible. You understand? What are you going to do? Put a bunch of bananas on a ship and sail it from Guatemala to Massachusetts? But by the time it got here, those bananas would have disintegrated into just mush. It would have taken months to get here. Bananas spoil. They're perishable. So think about just your diet. Your diet living in New England, you would only have access to food grown and harvested within, say, 30 miles of your house. Your diet would be much different. No bananas for you. No avocado toast for you. So this is what they mean by that. We have this new technology now that we all take for granted. It allows us access to things from thousands of miles away. That's a brand new thing in human history. Pessimistic predictions. Malthus and Ricardo were 2 kind of economists and social scientists during this time that made predictions that were very pessimistic. Malthus predicted that population growth, so the population of the whole world starts going up rapidly during this period of the Industrial Revolution, and his concern was there's going to be too many people and not enough food, and everyone's going to starve. Ricardo had a similar position, having to do with there's more people, too many people, that means everyone gets paid less. Both of these predictions are predicated on supply and demands and an inflexible interpretation of supply and demands. Supply and demands, really important concept to understand economics and just a lot of things in life. Supply and demand. Supply, how much of something is there? Demand, how valuable is it? How much do people want it? And usually it's inversely proportional, meaning one goes up, the other one goes down. Okay. Let's look at Ricardo. Population growth will steadily drive wages down. Why? He's saying the supply of people, of workers, is going up. There's more people being born. The population is going up. That means there's more workers. The supply is going up. Therefore, the demand for those workers goes down, because the more of something there is, the less valuable it is, because there's more of it, right? Things that are rare in low supply are more valuable, are more expensive. So Ricardo was saying here, there's going to be so many people that the value of each worker is going to be very low because they're easily replaceable. And since the demand is low, price follows demand, and people aren't going to get paid a lot. Both of these predictions were wrong. And thankfully, because if these predictions were correct, most of us would have never been born, because 200 years ago, everyone would have starved to death because there would have been too many people and not enough food or money. That was basically the prediction. But they were wrong. What did they miss? Important thing for you to understand in life, important thing for you to understand about this country specifically, and just an important outlook that you can apply to different parts of your life. Resources, wealth, let's say wealth. Wealth is not finite. Wealth can be created. This is what these guys missed, and a lot of people miss this. And it's important that you understand this point of view, because you can apply this to different walks of your own life. Wealth, resources, whatever it is, it's not finite. Wealth can be created. So let's walk through an analogy about pizza. If all of the money, let's say, in a society is represented by a pizza, and there are more and more and more people, what's going to happen? The pizza's not getting bigger because it's finite. This is the worldview that most people had for all of human history. There's a certain amount of pizza. The pizza represents money, let's say. The more and more people there are, well, that means each person has a smaller share of the pie. So if you have that one pizza and it's just for you, you're going to be full. You're going to be fine. If it's you and 3 of your friends, you each have 2 pieces of pizza. That's not bad. You know, you're all right. If it's, however, you and 100 other people sharing that pizza, nobody's getting enough food. So what does that mean? What are you going to have to do? You're going to have to fight and maybe kill to secure enough pizza for yourself that you don't starve. You understand? And for all of human history, this is how most people treated resources, wealth, money. There's a certain amount of land, whatever it is, whatever resource we're talking about. There's a certain amount of money. The only way to make sure I get my fair share is to kill my neighbor and take it. And that's all of human history. Here is what especially Americans figured out. We don't need to live that way. We don't need to fight constantly over the pizza. We can instead use our intelligence to find out a way to produce thousands of pizzas. And then instead of killing each other over the scraps of that one pizza, we can think in abundance. We can produce unlimited amounts of pizza. And that way, just because your neighbor has a whole pizza to themselves, that doesn't mean you need to kill your neighbor and take his pizza, because now we have ways to create enough pizza for everybody. I hope you understand the analogy. think about your personal life. If you see someone that has something that you want, whatever it is, if it's a material thing, whatever it is, you don't need to envy that person and think to yourself, the only way I can ever have that is to kill that person and take their stuff. You live in a country that is capable of figuring out ways to produce more of whatever that thing is so that everybody gets at least a little bit of that thing. And we don't need to tear each other down. We can lift each other up by creating more resources. Does that mean everyone's going to have the same amount of whatever the resource is? No. There's going to be people with a lot more pizza than others, but everyone's going to have enough to survive. All right. I hope you followed that analogy. Very, very important kind of distinction between two ways of looking at the world. If you, as an individual, go through life with the attitude that life is a zero-sum game and everyone that has something is at your expense, right? If someone has something that you would like to have, it's because they took it from you, or the only way you could ever hope to get it is to take it from them. You're going to live a miserable life. You can't live your life that way. I mean, you can, but you're going to be miserable. If, however, you think more optimistically and say, whatever it is that I value, that I want, that this person has, I feel like I can figure out a way to provide that thing for myself, and I don't need to take it from my neighbor. I can figure out how to provide it for myself. Really important, just big picture, how do you look at life, turning point. During the early industrial age, states, and that means governments, began using taxes to build and expand infrastructure. So, for example, we were just talking about trains. You invent steam engines and trains. Well, great. But a train is worthless unless you build a huge network of railroad tracks that the trains travel on. Later, so roads, bridges, canals, railroads. Later on, when the car is invented, that's great, but cars aren't very practical unless you build a huge network of highways and roads to drive the cars on. Is this a wise investment? Very often it is. The question is, how much do we as a government, as taxpayers, want to spend on this infrastructure for all this new technology? And who benefits from it, right? How much do we spend? Who should pay for it? Who benefits from it? Okay, how many roads, bridges, and now it would be airports, etc. How much infrastructure do we need to provide for our economy and make sure that everyone in this country has access? They can travel freely and relatively easily and cheaply to get to the store, to get to the hospital, to get to school, to get to work, whatever it is. That's expensive, but it is necessary for the economy that we all just take for granted. The Luddite movement is a really important issue, very timely issue that you might do a current event on. The Luddite movement is the name of a movement that sought to stop or roll back technological progress. Why would certain people be opposed to new technology? Well, for example, when the light bulbs were invented, and like we can't imagine life without electricity now, right? We all take it for granted. When the light bulbs were invented, that's a great leap forward, right? That's great progress, of course. Who would be against that? Candle makers. You understand? If you fed your family by making candles and all of a sudden this new technology is invented, the light bulb, no one's buying candles anymore, right? So you're going to lose your job. So you might be a Luddite. You might say, hey, I'm not feeling this new technology because some people like it and that's great, but I just lost my job. When the car was invented, what happened to people that made their living building carriages for horses to pull? Well, most of them lost their job. So this is called creative destruction. And that term Luddite today is used to refer to anyone who is unwilling to use the newest technology. So let's think about modern examples of this because you see it everywhere. It's a big issue and you can do a current event on this. Creative destruction. You ever go to the supermarket or any kind of store really, and very often there'll be the majority of people that are paying for stuff, they're doing self-checkout, right? So It used to be you would go to Walmart and there would be 12 lanes and there would be 12 cashiers. There'd be 12 people there getting paid to scan your items and take your payment. But now there's not 12 people there at the checkout working as cashiers. There's maybe two people, and everyone else, you're just going up and scanning your own items and paying and going on your way. Well, that might be convenient for you, but what happened to those other 10 people? What happened to those jobs? They disappeared. Think about your iPhone. I'm sure all of you have a smartphone. Think about the things that you do with your phone. Okay. And think about before the smartphone existed, how many different products you would have to buy that now you don't need to buy because you just do it all on your phone. And then think about how many jobs have been lost because of the invention of the smartphone. Okay, that's creative destruction. The smartphone is a creation that we all can't live without now. We all take it for granted. Like, we love it. If you leave the house without your smartphone, you freak out, right? You can't go a day without it. You got to go back. You got to go home and get your phone. That's the creative part, but there's always a destruction that comes with the creation. So what was destroyed by the creation of the smartphone? Well, back in the day when I was your age, 25 years ago, here are some things that I would have had to buy that I bought back in the day that today you probably don't need. And you probably haven't gone out and bought these things because you do them all on your phone. Ready? I'm going to walk you through some examples. Things that when I was your age, when I was 19, 20 years old, I had to buy all these things, and now you don't need to buy them. Stereo. You probably don't have a stereo with big speakers, right? Because you just listen to music on your phone. CDs, records, and tapes. You probably don't buy hard copies. You probably don't have a big stack of CDs or records or tapes. You probably just listen to Spotify. So what happened to all those jobs? People that make and sell stereos and speakers, people that make and sell CDs, records, and tapes. Most of those jobs are gone. You don't need those things anymore. You do it all through your phone. Cameras. Most of you just take pictures with your camera phone. You don't buy a separate camera that you hold around your neck. You don't take pictures and then take it to a camera shop to develop the film and print out hard copies of the photographs. Most people don't do that anymore. What happened to the camera industry? It got wiped out. You probably don't have an alarm clock. You probably just set the clock on your phone. You probably don't have maps in your car. You just type in GPS and your phone tells you where to go. You probably don't wear a watch. You probably just look at your phone if you need to know what time it is. You probably don't have a flashlight. You probably just use the flashlight on your phone. You probably don't have a calculator. You just use the calculator on your phone. And on and on and on. You see what I'm saying? What happened to all the jobs of people that used to make stereos, speakers, CDs, records, and tapes, TVs, DVD players, VCRs, wristwatches, alarm clocks, calendars, maps, calculators? What happened to all those jobs? But they disappeared. They were destroyed. That's creative destruction. What happened to Blockbuster Video? You used to have to go to a store to rent a movie if you wanted to watch a movie at your house. You don't do that anymore. You Netflix and chill. All right, that's convenient. What happened to all those jobs at Blockbuster Video? Gone. Creative destruction. So think about that. We see that all throughout our society. I guess the most obvious big one on the horizon now is AI, artificial intelligence. That's a new creation, new technology. Huge numbers of jobs will be destroyed by that technology. And so if you are paranoid or scared or threatened by new technology because you might lose your job, for example, that's what the Luddite movement is about. It's a timeless thing, creative destruction. In terms of business practices, Andrew Carnegie practiced something called vertical integration in the steel industry. Vertical integration, so top to bottom, that means every step in a process of making something is owned by one entity, by one business. So for example, steel, to get a finished piece of usable steel, it's a multi-step process. Mining, all right, you got to mine, you got to dig under the earth to find the rocks that have iron in them. That's a big, complex, expensive thing to do. Then you need to transport the the iron ore that you dug out of the earth to a furnace, to a processing plant. You smelt it, you melt it down to separate the iron out of the rock. You have to add carbon to it to make it into steel. You got to refine it and roll it out into something that's usable. Maybe it's sheets, big sheets for the side of a ship. Maybe it's I-beams for a skyscraper. It's a multi-step process. And what this is saying is if one company is in charge of every step of the process, one company owns the mines, they own all the equipment, they own the railroads and the tracks to carry the materials from the mine to the factory, they own the factory, they own the furnaces and the smelters, they own the trucks that bring the finished pieces to the construction site, whatever it is. If one company owns every step rather than this being 4, 5, 6, 7 separate companies, it is more efficient, it's more streamlined, it's one thing, one big thing rather than several small things. It's like an empire instead of a bunch of small nations. And what's the benefit to vertical integration? It's one thing, it's one company, it's one set of overhead, it's one set of insurance, it's one payroll, it's one integrated thing. And so that means it's going to be more efficient, it's going to be cheaper. And when you get that product, it's cheaper because there are fewer middlemen. There's not 5 different companies involved, there's one. That's going to make it cheaper. Now, the downside is, the threat is that company is going to get so big and rich that it can just kind of destroy all the competition. So vertical integration, we just went through that. Horizontal integration is another way to do this. And these are different types of monopolies. So vertical is you own every step. So the image on the left here is another example of vertical integration. So if the product is meat, what are the different steps in the vertical process? Well, starts with the cattle. So in this example, if you own the lands that the cattle are living on, and then you own the slaughterhouse, and you own the refrigerated railroad cars that carry the meat, and you own the warehouses where it's processed, and you own the meat packing plants where it's, divvied up, and here, this is going to be steak, this is going to be hamburger, whatever, and you own the delivery systems, wagons, trucks, whatever it would be, and you own the final step, which would be the McDonald's or the butcher shop or whatever. If you own every step, same thing, integrated, cheaper, efficient, and by the time that cheeseburger gets to the customer, it's going to be cheaper than if there's 7 or 8, 9 different companies involved in each step. Horizontal is, instead of top to bottom, each step, it's side to side. So you go out buying up and taking over every business in that field. So if the product is oil, vertical integration would be you own the land where you're drilling, you own all the drills, you own the refineries, you own the trucks, you own the gas station. Horizontal would be, if we're talking about gas stations, you go out and buy up every other gas station that there is. Or if the product is meat, you go out and buy up every McDonald's. That would be horizontal. And so if you can combine both of those, you're going to have enormous, incredibly powerful businesses, which will be efficient and will give relatively cheap products. But those businesses are going to be so powerful that they could become too powerful. That's the threat, in theory. This is the first time where this issue of social Darwinism comes in. We'll get into this in depth, and I want to say the next unit when we get to European imperialism. They're introducing it here because we're talking about business, and this applies to many walks of life, including business. So if you've heard of Darwin, wrote the Origin of Species and Natural Selection, the modern evolutionary theory. And if you boil Darwin down, you put it on a bumper sticker, it's survival of the fittest. And he was talking about animals. Why do some animals thrive and survive, and other animals go extinct. Survival of the fittest. Random mutation, natural selection. If the lion's faster than the gazelle, the lion is going to eat and survive and thrive, and sucks to be the gazelle, but that's nature. Survival of the fittest. Social Darwinism is taking that Darwinism, survival of the fittest, and applying it not to animals, but to people. And in the business context, if you have certain companies like Rockefeller and Carnegie with US Steel, Standard Oil, et cetera, that are buying up and destroying all the competition, social Darwinists would say, hey, survival of the fittest. Companies that are less fit, that are weaker, are going to go extinct. And the fittest, the dominant ones, whether it's US Steel in the current context, maybe it's Amazon, maybe it's Walmart, they're going to destroy their competition. And that's okay, according to this ideology, because that's how the world works. Some people are more fit than others. That's how sports works, isn't it? Someone's going to win, someone's going to lose. That's the nature of it. And so social Darwinism is saying if businesses dominate and, buy up and destroy other businesses, there's nothing wrong with that. According to this view, that's nature. It's survival of the fittest. So we'll get back into social Darwinism in much more depth in a different unit. This process that we're going through here with all this new technology coming online and new businesses becoming huge and wealthier than any other businesses ever had in human history, there's a concern that those monopolies, we talked about monopoly earlier in a different context, companies that control nearly all ownership of a product or service. Pros and cons. The pro is they're big, efficient companies that can get you relatively cheap products. And the con is there's a threat of too much power in the hands of too few people. And that in a country like ours, this is what the cartoon here is about, you could have big businesses dominating the government. They could be so powerful and rich that our elected representatives, for example, might just listen to them and not normal people like us. That's the threat. So in terms of the modern context, I'm going to jump ahead for 1 minute. Okay. I'll go a little bit over an hour on this one, but we're close enough that I can finish it in one piece. If you want to do a current event on this, I urge you to really think this through. In the modern context, do we have monopolies in this country that are a threat, in your opinion? National Grid, that's the they keep renaming themselves. It might be a different name now, but that's basically a monopoly on electricity in this part of the country. It is the dominant electricity company. If you want electricity, which is a necessity, 90% of the time you have to go through National Grid. The thing that I think is more interesting for you to think about is the social media environment. Are there monopolies in that realm of our society, do you think? And if so, is it a danger? Google/YouTube. Google owns YouTube. I'll get back to that in a minute because I think that's maybe the best example. Facebook, Twitter, X, whatever, Apple, Amazon, these are huge dominant industries that destroy a lot of the competition and have a lot of power. And do you think that might be a threat? Let's look at Google. I think this is a clear example of a monopoly. So let me walk you through an example of how powerful Google is. Because I don't know if you ever thought about this or if you think this is an issue. What product does Google provide? Well, Google is primarily, they do a lot, right? Email, they do all kinds of stuff, but primarily it's a search engine, right? It is the dominant search engine. I don't know what the closest competitor to Google is. But here's how dominant Google is. When you need to look up something online, just a random piece of information, how do you describe that process? What do you tell if someone asks you, hey, they need to know a certain piece of information, what do you tell them to do? You say, Google it. Do you not? You use the word Google as a verb. Google it. You ever think about that? That is an insane amount of power. A private company is so dominant that the name of the company is a verb. You Google something. That's wild. There's no equivalent of that. You Google something. When you drive to work, you don't Honda to work. You see what I'm saying? You don't Toyota to work. You drive to work. But when you look up something on the internet, you Google it. The closest competition to Google, I don't even what is it? DuckDuckGo? I don't know. Bing? You ever hear someone to say, hey, who won the Super Bowl last year? I don't know, just Bing it. Nobody says that. You Google it. That's power. Is that a threat? I don't know. What do they control? The access to information. It's a lot of power. When you type something into a Google search engine, when you Google something, it's running through an algorithm that is very specific, that is intentionally designed by people who have points of view and biases, and that's fine. But that's a lot of power. If Google doesn't want you to see something, you're probably not going to see it. Let me tell you a quick story. Last summer, after the first assassination attempt on President Trump, I don't know if you heard this story. It was maybe a week afterwards, somebody noticed this. You know, when you Google something, you can start typing something in and it'll autofill, right? Well, in the days after that assassination attempt, if you went to Google and you typed in attempted assassination of, what do you think should have popped up? If you're going to Google and typing in attempted assassination of in the days after President Trump came within an eighth of an inch of having his brains blown out on live television, you would think Google would know that that's what you're interested in researching, right? And you would think it would autofill. Well, it didn't. And I did this, take my word for it. They've since changed it, but I did this at the time. Attempted assassination of, and the autofill list was attempted assassination of Ronald Reagan, Pope John Paul II, Bob Marley. That's fine. But in the days after President Trump nearly got his head blown off, you would think that's what people would be looking up, not Ronald Reagan, but it wasn't on the list. It gets better. You ready for this? So I start typing in attempted assassination of, doesn't autofill Trump. Okay. I start typing T, nothing. R, nothing. U, nothing. M, attempted assassination of TRUM. And then it autofills to say, to finish the last name, TRUM. You know what Google finished? AN, Truman. Attempted assassination of Truman. President Harry Truman, there was an assassination attempt on him in 1950. Were people in 2024, after President Trump was shot in the head, typing in, suddenly obsessed with researching the attempted assassination of Harry Truman from 75 years earlier? No. So what's going on at Google? I don't know, but it's just one trivial example of Google has power. We all use it. It's an amazing service. I use Google in different ways every day. The point is, they got a lot of power. They frame the narrative. Does that concern you? If all these groups get together and decide we want to push this story, we want to suppress this story, we want to frame this way, we want to ignore this, we want to we want to really focus in on this. That's all good. Is it dangerous? What else we got? Disney. You know, it'll be interesting if you want to do this. Look up Disney and look up what Disney owns. Companies that are owned by Disney. Okay. Disney owns certain companies that you might think are so big and powerful and valuable that no one could own them. Disney owns them. And so the danger, in theory, if you wanted to boycott Disney because there's something about Disney you don't like, you know what that would mean? You know what you would have to boycott? Everything Disney owns, such as ESPN. Do you know Disney owns ESPN? If you want to boycott Disney for some reason, that means you can't watch SportsCenter. Disney owns Hulu. No streaming for you if you're mad at Disney. Disney owns Star Wars. Disney owns ABC. Is that a danger? This is a timeless question. Whether it's tangible stuff like steel and oil, whether it's intangible stuff like information or entertainment, you should ask yourself this question: is there a danger in one company controlling all of a certain thing? As businesses and corporations grow larger and more powerful, workers began to practice collective bargaining to protect their interests. So companies get bigger and bigger and bigger, and the workers feel less valuable, and they join together to try to demand better conditions, better pay, etc. The Knights of Labor was the first national labor union. It pushed for things that we take for granted: an 8-hour workday, an end to child labor. Who may have opposed these proposals? Who would have been against ending child labor? Well, an obvious answer would be the business owners, right? But what you might find interesting is actually a lot of the parents of kids that were working opposed ending child labor. And that might seem strange to you. Why would a parent want their kid to work in a factory? Well, they wouldn't. No one wants their 9-year-old working in a factory. If the 9-year-old is working in a factory, it's because the parents think or know that the family will starve without that extra income, right? Period. No one wants their child to work in a factory. If the child's working in a factory, it's because it is a really unfortunate necessity. And if the government comes along and says to the parent, your kid can't work, the parent might react by saying, excuse me, government, you're not helping. My child needs to work in order to feed the family. We don't like it, but that's the way it is. So that might be counterintuitive, but this is not, we take it for granted now that no one wants kids working. At the time, it was not that simple, right? There was pushback from places that you might not predict. Although, let me go back to this for a minute. Supply and demands. This worked out well. You know why? When you say that kids can't work, what happens to the supply of workers? It goes down. You just reduce the supply by taking all the kids out of the workforce, right? Since the supply of workers just went down, the demand for workers goes up. Supply and demand, one goes down, the other one goes up. Take kids out of the workforce, supply goes down. Who's left? The adults. Since there are now fewer workers because there's no kids allowed to work, the demand for workers goes up. What does that mean? The adults get paid more. The less workers there are, the more valuable each worker is. So this worked out really well. Kids don't need to work. Adults get paid more. The end of slavery. 1807, British Parliament abolishes the slave trade and ends slave in all of its colonies. It's a remarkable thing. It's not something we should take for granted. Slavery, as we've covered, was universal, and do not take this for granted. For someone to come along and say, the thing that all of us, this is what the British did, this thing that all people, including us, the British, this thing that all people have been doing for all of human history, it's wrong and we need to stop. Don't take that for granted. That's a miracle. That doesn't just happen. Okay? The idea that this was universal, slavery was practiced everywhere since before people knew how to write things down. And for a group of people to come along and say, hey, you know that thing that everyone has been doing everywhere forever? It's wrong. We need to stop. That's an amazing thing. And a lot of people predicted we can't do that. If you end slavery, the entire economy will collapse because who will do all the work? It's a remarkable thing that this happens. However, the Industrial Revolution especially the textile factories where they're making clothing, for example, is still dependent on cotton from the American South, where there was still slavery. Now, roughly 50 years after this, the American Civil War happens, and then slavery ends in the United States as well. But this is the beginning of the end of slavery. It is a miracle. And by the way, did the global economy collapse after slavery ended? No. The global economy over the last 200 years has grown exponentially, and the world is now richer by a lot than it ever has been. And that started exactly when slavery ended. So slavery was not only evil, it's stupid. It kept people poor. When slavery ended, every country in the world started getting a lot richer. The Communist Manifesto emerges during this period. Some main ideas from it. Well, there's so much here. I mean, we could spend 3 hours on the Communist Manifesto. We'll get into communism a little bit later in the course. For now, though, just the theory of it. Okay, this mid 1800s is when the book was written. The first time that the idea of communism was actually implemented in real life is much later. It's the Russian Revolution. We'll get to that later. But in terms of just the theory, this is when the theory became widespread before it was actually put into effect. One of the main ideas in the Communist Manifesto: from each according to their ability, to each according to their need. So each person needs to contribute based on their ability. Some of us are able to do more than others, and each person needs to receive things based on what they need. Some of us need more help than others, okay? So as just a framework for how to approach sharing resources, let's say, I can tell you that my family, I run a communist household. And when I say that, I mean the idea that you see here, I incorporate that this is how I run my household. From each according to their ability. I have the ability to earn money. My children don't. To each according to their needs. My children need a lot more resources than I do. So how does my household work? My wife and I do all the work. We, right, from each according to their ability, my wife and I earn 100% of the money, and we then spend, to each according to their need, we spend 80% of our money on our kids who earned 0% of the money. You see what I'm saying? We have the ability to provide resources. They need the resources. There's an imbalance there. You understand what I'm saying? I don't tell my 11-year-old, go to work if you want a new video game. He doesn't have the ability to do that. I don't tell my 7-year-old daughter, go get a job if you want a new stuffed animal. I don't tell my 3-year-old son, I'm not buying you any more apple juice because you're not contributing to the household income, because, I'm not a monster. I transfer all of what I earn to my children. Right? And I think if you think about your family, that's probably how most families operate. Okay. So the idea is fantastic. The question is not, is that how you run your family? The question is, do you want to give the government the power to say to hundreds of millions of people, we're going to tell you how much of your property you need to give us, the government, and then we're going to give your property to other people based on what we think they need? That's a much different question. That's a much different question. Now, the way that idea is implemented today in our country, this is not a communist country, but we have adopted certain communist ideas, especially specifically what's called the progressive income tax, which says the more money you make, the higher percentage you pay into taxes. And that's this idea in practice. People with more money have more ability to pay more taxes, and people who don't make any money don't have the ability to pay taxes, but they do have needs because they don't have as much money as some other people. Therefore, the government takes significant amounts of money from people that make money, and they give that money to people that don't make money. That's how our tax system works. So you can see some of the data here. We don't need to get too much into the weeds, but basically half of the country roughly pays no taxes, no income tax, and they get money, maybe not direct cash payments. It could be direct cash payments, but it could be Medicaid. It could be uh, food stamps. It could be Section 8. Could be, any number of things. They get resources, money, property, healthcare, housing, food, cash payments, whatever it is. Where does that money come from? It comes from people that earn more money, that the government says, hey, to people that earn money, hey, you have the ability, you pay in, and we're going to take your money and give it to people that we think need it more than you do. And most people think that's totally reasonable. And that's an idea that originates with the Communist Manifesto. We'll get into the actual practice of communism a little later in the course, because it starts with this really appealing idea of, some of us have the ability to share with more needy people, and that's great. Spoiler alert, when those ideas were implemented in real life, it led to the murder of 100 million people. So something went sideways there. We'll get to that in a couple of units. The emergence of socialism and communism are very, very similar. We don't need to get too into the weeds, but they're, right next to each other on that spectrum I showed you a few units back, if you remember that. The idea of communism and socialism in general are that capitalism, they believed, fomented a selfish individualism. That, yeah, if everyone's out for themselves trying to get rich, that's selfish and that's not good for society. That's their belief. And they believe that private property should be regulated by the government, strictly regulated. That's more socialism. Or abolished outright and replaced by state or community ownership. That's communism. This is not an either or zero-sum game. Every single government on earth today has at least some influence from these ideas. I just walked you through how the United States is not a communist country, but we do have ideas from the Communist Manifesto, such as graduated progressive income tax. And by the way, you know what else is in the Communist Manifesto? Abolishing child labor and making public school tuition free at point of service. And that's something we adopted as well. So it's not a country is either capitalist or communist. All countries have some kind of mix of both. Okay. So there are certain parts of the Communist Manifesto that most Americans reject, but there are certain parts of it actually that most Americans think are reasonable and that we have adopted for ourselves, even though we're not a communist country. All right, so that is it for this unit. Thanks for joining, and I will see you next time.